searching for the hero inside, 'cause he's soaring through the air, and it's really quite amazing. Every eye turned up, their hearts he's elevating.
Welcome, everyone, to the latest episode of the DCEU and Me. This is the episode where we go through all of the DC Expanded Universe movies. We give our thoughts, and, we hope to provide and shed some new light on this franchise and its rise and fall. We are going to be talking about 2016's Suicide Squad. This was a divisive movie when it came out. However, I would say that I don't fully believe maybe that it was quite as divisive as a lot of people say. But we'll get to more of that in a minute. So, let's get started. The Suicide Squad released it back in August of 2016. It was a pretty highly anticipated film. And it was coming off of Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. So this takes place in a post-Superman world. And there was a little bit of that played into the plot. And, the basic synopsis for this film was a secret government agency recruits some of the most dangerous incarcerated supervillains to form a defensive task force. Their first mission, save the world from the apocalypse. So let's go into a little bit of the box office for this film and what it earned. So in total, this film earned $325 million domestic, $424 million international, for a worldwide total of $749 million. Now, it must be said, a lot of people will say like, oh, that's not terribly impressive. But what needs to be said at the time is that this film did not secure a China release. So this was an everywhere but China release of the film. And so for this film at the time to make $750 million without China, because you have to remember at this time, superhero movies were absolutely going bananas in China at this time. And movies were just making bank in the Middle Kingdom. It was always viewed very negatively if a superhero film could not get a release in China. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to Black Adam. So the fact that this film was able to garner that much cash without that is quite impressive. Its opening was also very impressive, $133 million, so clearly the marketing, everything, it did its job. People, went in there to see that film. Now, needless to say, the critics were not terribly kind. Out of 390 reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, Suicide Squad only was 26% positive. Now, its audience scores, which was 100,000 plus. Now, I must say also, and this is kind of important to distinguish, is that back then, verified audience scores were not a thing with Rotten Tomatoes. So a lot of the scores from before they introduced that kind of have to be taken with a little bit more of a grain of salt, just because films were way more susceptible to review bombing, both in favor of and opposing of a film. So it had a 58% positive from audience members, which of course is way, way better, than the critic score, but still a little low. That being said, it does have to be said that at this point in the DCEU, the Marvel versus DC war was in full, was being waged fully, by fans. DC fans were review bombing Marvel films and vice versa. So it is difficult to say, with like Man of Steel, BVS, Suicide Squad, it's difficult to say exactly what these audience scores really were, just because of the fan war that was going on. So yeah, so it's quite interesting, to say, just kind of what was going on. What do you think, Curry?
It always shocks me how much money this movie made and how good the marketing was, given that the movie isn't super well beloved, and the fact that it is Oscar-winning Suicide Squad. It won for makeup, and honestly, the makeup kind of deserved it, especially looking at Killer Croc and Harley Quinn and the Joker and all that. The Rotten Tomatoes score is what it is. The DCEU was, everybody just wanted to hate on it at the time, which we've talked about in previous episodes. I'm not surprised this one has a lower score, because it's not on the level of something like BVS and Man of Steel. But the fact that it's close makes me not happy. So just to kind of get the elephant out of the way, the elephant in the room out of the way, which I think there are two when it comes to this movie. We'll start with the small one. Jared Leto's Joker, I think he was okay. I don't love him and I don't hate him. I actually like him better in Zack Snyder's Justice League. I appreciate, though, that they tried really hard not to recreate Jack Nicholson, not recreate Heath Ledger, not even recreate Mark Hamill in live action. But they really went for their own unique take. And I like what we saw, but I wanted more. There was not enough for him to do in the theatrical cut or the extended cut. And there's so much in the trailers that we see, and I mentioned how good the trailers were and how much footage they have that weren't in the final movie. They definitely, like with Bohemian Rhapsody being like the main song, I felt like they were trying to position this as like DC's Guardians of the Galaxy villains, street level.
I completely agree, Curry. The elephant in the room really is Joker. This was probably the lightning rod that got a lot of people, upset, and there was a lot of fans as well. But an interesting fact about Joker, I don't know if you knew this, but an interesting fact was that it was reported that Ryan Gosling had actually been offered the role of the Joker first, but had actually turned it down. And so that role would eventually go to Jared Leto. And I completely agree that he didn't have enough to do. He had a very, very small role in the theatrical cut, slightly expanded in the extended, but it was just, to me, it was just rough because, I completely agree with you that I appreciate that, that they weren't copying other types of Jokers. Jared Leto was not just being Heath Ledger. He was not just being Jack Nicholson. He was not just being, Cesar Romero, that he truly was his own Joker. And, I think a lot of people kind of still hadn't kind of gotten over Heath Ledger yet, just because of that iconic performance. And they just kind of weren't ready, I think, for the type of Joker that we got, because obviously Ayer comes from, LA, and he had been kind of open about how his Joker was kind of this more cholo gangster Joker, who kind of had a cartel vibe to him, his gold guns, tattoos and everything. And it was just very different, but I really appreciated how different it was. And I do also completely agree with you that I thought Jared Leto was a lot better in Zack Snyder's Justice League. And, and it kind of just, and we'll talk about this more, in future episodes, but it just kind of further confirms to me that, like, I really kind of feel like Zack Snyder should have directed the DCEU Batman movie, just because we see how well Joker did under his hand. We see how excellent Ben Affleck's Batman was, that I just can't help but think, man, if we would have had a Joker versus Batman Snyder film, that was, that would have been amazing. And so, so it's very interesting. And I'm very interested in potentially, what could have been, unfortunately. And another interesting thing that I would like to say about the Joker is that we see online all of the hate for him. We see all of the people who just like hate him. He's the worst Joker ever, and everything. But I think what is actually fascinating is that we see, like, how much kind of his Joker did tap into culture with a lot of younger people, because, to this day, his Joker is one of the most popular cosplayed Jokers that you see at conventions. I mean, you see older ones too, but you see a lot of Leto Jokers, out there. I remember back in the day as well, like at Hot Topic and other places where they had t-shirts, they had stuff with his Joker all over, and it would sell out. It was like they could not keep that stuff in stock. Like, people absolutely loved it. And then, we see like the music video that he was in, Purple Lamborghini, that came out before this, went over 1 billion views. It's like, so clearly this Joker did tap into something that a lot of the older fans didn't like. It was possible that the younger fans actually did like it, and then, like I said, once everybody saw Zack Snyder's Justice League and they saw his scene in it, a lot of people were very on board for his Joker after that. They were like, oh man, this is actually like this is a sinister Joker who's like actually pretty good. And yeah, so it's very, very interesting with some of the casting choices that existed for several of these other characters, like Amanda Waller, for example, that, you had Viola Davis, Octavia Spencer, and Oprah Winfrey all considered for the role. Harley Quinn, actually, Emma Roberts was offered the role before Margot Robbie, but she turned it down for the TV series Scream Queens. Talk about a career blunder right there. And also Rick Flag, that the original actor who was offered that role was Tom Hardy. And apparently Tom Hardy loved the script and wanted to be in it. So he was ready to accept the role, but ended up having to drop out due to his role in The Revenant. And also Jake Gyllenhaal was also offered the role of Rick Flag, but declined. And so, we all know then obviously who was originally cast. But just some very interesting. I'm very curious to, it's kind of fun to think about, like, what would a Suicide Squad look like that, had Oprah Winfrey as Amanda Waller, Tom Hardy as Rick Flag, and Emma Roberts as Harley Quinn, and Ryan Gosling as Joker. Very, very interesting thing to think about. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the Ayer Cut, because this is obviously another elephant that, as I think a lot of people know, especially from the fan campaigns, that there was a backlash, that happened obviously to BVS when it came out. And due to that reception to that film, and also the incredible success of Deadpool and Guardians of the Galaxy, Warner Brothers panicked. And the original Suicide Squad cut that Ayer had done was a dark, moody, and serious film. It was, he said there was humor in it, but it was not comedic. It was meant to be a serious movie. And when Warner Brothers panicked, they decided that wasn't the way they wanted to go with the movie. And so they brought in a company called Trailer Park. And this was the company that had edited the trailers for Suicide Squad. And they asked them to create a lighter studio flavored version of Suicide Squad to put out in theaters. Also, the original music score for the Ayer Cut was completely changed. And they instead changed it to the pop infused radio play, as it was called. Another thing that's also important notation was that the film was originally 2 hours and 45 minutes long. Quite a long movie. And when you look at the original film, that means approximately 40 to 45 minutes, was cut from the original runtime. And there was a huge amount of scenes that were cut and were changed, and I'll go through a couple of those real quick just to kind of give you an idea. For example, the Batman and Deadshot scene, there was a lot that was changed there. It was originally much more darker, and Batman was more taunting. And for example, Batman has an original line, the Deadshot, where he talks about Deadshot's daughter saying she'll have gray hair when you see her again, and they'd kind of decided that didn't really fit with Batman too much. So they did change some of that. There was a lot of Harley Quinn and Joker origin scenes that were different. There was a lot of lines that were changed, and there was just a lot of things that were way darker. And there was, for example, some of the script with Harley Quinn was described as more sexy but potentially gratuitous. Kind of showed a little bit more of the Joker's fondness for her. There was more scenes of Joker and in the hotel, like when he's laying around his knives and everything. There was more of that. There was also the opening sequence with Arkham Asylum was extended. There was an extended scene of Joker's, Arkham Asylum assault. The version of Monster T's death was also changed completely, that the Ayer Cut was more of an elaborate psychological manipulation, where basically he gets Monster T to actually kill himself instead of Joker killing him. And there was a lot more interactions between the task force with June Moon and Rick Flag. There was more action sequences. There was also, an original third act that was completely different, that actually involved the Joker with Enchantress. There was a bunch of stuff like that. There was also a lot of rumors that Steppenwolf was actually involved as the third act boss. That is actually not correct fully. I know that Ayer and them had mentioned that was an idea to kind of tie in a little bit to Justice League and BVS. However, it appears that that particular aspect of the script didn't make it past the first draft. So that was not something that was ever filmed, or anything like that. So yeah, it's quite interesting to kind of see just like what could have been. As I'm sure everybody knows, there is quite a campaign right now, to get the Ayer Cut released. We actually had a line from James Gunn, when he talked to Ayer, that he said it would see the light of day at some point. Now, we don't know if that's true or not. With the potential of the Netflix Warner Brothers purchase, I think it's more likely that we could see it. But yeah, it's quite interesting. But there was a lot of fan attention to try and get this Ayer Cut released. Curious to hear your thoughts, Curry.
The Ayer Cut, right? We didn't get that. And it's a shame because there's so much potential in this movie. The first act of this film is so engrossing and is so strong and always fools me into thinking that I'm going to be watching a better movie than I am. And that's because Ayer did have a very singular vision, and I would love to see all the stuff that was cut. And I know there were plans of like Steppenwolf was going to be in it. I don't think that made it past like the scripting phase, but there were so many more things that tied into Justice League. And honestly, I'm not even aware of all of the stuff that was different. But more Joker is one thing that I really wanted, and there's supposed to be more character focus because the reshoots, I remember the time I didn't notice them as much. I was younger, almost 10 years ago. But like the more you watch it, the more apparent they become. If you watch Rick Flagg's hair in the movie, like it's really apparent where the reshoots are.
I completely remember that. I remember when I rewatched it that I was like, what's going on with his hair? Like it, as you said, it was very obvious.
And there's so much personality going on here, and sometimes it's just too much. When it's focusing on being like a punk rock, like almost music video montage style villain movie with that graffiti style, it really works. But then when it tries to do the Marvel-isms and be funny, it doesn't. It starts to fall flat. And one area that I wish the movie was a lot stronger in was the action. I thought the action was super underwhelming with the CGI monsters and stuff. I would have actually preferred the villain of the film, while it worked to be Enchantress, the whole plan around Enchantress is kind of dumb. I would have preferred the villain to be like someone like Lex Luthor or something more grounded for them to go up against that ends in a supernatural threat. Like have it be something else, and through that mission, Enchantress breaks free and she's the final boss of the movie.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like I wasn't terribly thrilled with Enchantress as the main villain. And I remember that there was kind of some rumors, before about like a more grounded villain. And I really do kind of wish that would have happened. Like maybe, I don't know, like Bane or something like that. And then, like you said, then maybe, Enchantress breaks free and you get that, but I completely agree.
That could have worked really well. There's too many characters in it. Like Katana gets almost nothing to do, and she's a really great character. And at the time, Arrow was going on, and I think it had just wrapped its third season, and which heavily features Katana and her entire story and backstory. And it was done so much better there. She looks good here. She looks like really cool and all that, as do a lot of the characters. I could go through each one. Rick Flag I thought was done well. Deadshot I thought was great. Harley is pretty much perfect. Who, I'm going to be honest, I'm kind of tired of Harley Quinn, though. Oversaturation, overrated character. Let's just go back to the Joker for a while. And Killer Croc, I loved the makeup, but he was way too small. He should have been like hulkish in size, but if the decision was to not do that, to keep him practical, I respect that decision. But Killer Croc's also supposed to be mutating, so if they ever bring him back, I want big boy Killer Croc. And there's just a lot of stuff in the movie that just like doesn't make sense. Like when El Diablo dies, love that fight of him when he turns into the big like demon looking form. Like Scott Eastwood dies, like when like all of it seemed like editing to wrap this up quickly, and it just didn't work for me. We needed more development in Rick Flag and Enchantress, but I enjoy Amanda Waller's presence in the movie. I enjoy how it's a direct response to Superman dying. That's a very organic in-world explanation for why the government would want something like this. I enjoy the setup with Justice League and Bruce Wayne's cameo. I enjoy the Batman scenes that are in it. Like, this is the only Batman and Joker scene we have in the DCEU, except for Justice League. And in here, they don't even speak to each other. And by Justice League, I mean the real Justice League. Yeah, I don't know. Part of me wants to defend this film, and part of me doesn't, because it was a sign of bad things to come. The first was BVS and, them not releasing the Ultimate Edition in theaters, making him cut out those 30 minutes. And then it was panicking to the response of that and doing all these reshoots to make Suicide Squad and Justice League basically more Marvel-like. And I love the MCU and I love Marvel, but it was, let's be more like them and not do our own thing. And they didn't trust their creatives. Now, I think sometimes studios have a right to shackle their creatives a little bit within reason, and it can help make a better product. Some of Snyder's ideas for the Justice League films I hated, and I'm glad that were killed off. But a lot of it I loved and wish we could have seen, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, a lot of people sometimes think that I'm like, oh, creatives should have completely free reign. And like, well, I do want creatives to have free reign. I agree. Like sometimes, some studio shackles aren't a bad thing, we've seen just kind of an example I can think of Rogue One, how sometimes some of those changes that Lucasfilms made to the original cut turned out to be really good. We got that hallway fight scene with Vader and everything. And I agree with you. Like some of Snyder's ideas for Justice League were not ones that I wanted to see, that I was like, I don't know about that. Like I just think to myself, like, I don't know if I would have wanted a whole Justice League movie that was on, the Earth, the future Earth with Batman. I mean, with Superman being evil. I don't know if, I like it in the clips. I like it in those little scenes. And I think, kind of it appears his later plan, of kind of merging that in, with the second film and the conclusion. I like that, but yeah, sometimes creatives need a firm hand.
I mean, just look at Zack Snyder's Justice League. I'm just forever curious about the Ayer Cut, and it's hard to talk about this movie and not think about what could have been and not what is. Right? We even got an extended cut. It's not like it didn't get any kind of additional thing. The extended cut, I think, adds like 12 minutes, and it adds some decent stuff, but it's not significant enough to make it feel like a different movie. I think it's like extended more of like what already was in the reshoots and not of what the original vision was. And I really hope Ayer gets his cut released. It seems like him and James Gunn are friends, and they've talked about it extensively, but they kind of missed the boat on doing it. They really should have capitalized on the hype after Zack Snyder's Justice League, like working up to those upcoming movies like during COVID. And when Zack Snyder's Justice League had such a strong debut and was in the cultural zeitgeist and everybody was positive and hopeful, they should have doubled down then and released it as a streaming exclusive in the pandemic era. But they didn't. And then Black Adam happened. That was the height. Everyone had hope again because Cavill was back. And then, behind the scenes, they were playing both sides. The studio was at war, and Pam Abdi and Michael DeLuca wanted Cavill back, and Zaslav had already commissioned James Gunn to do a script. So it's like, and there was just warring, and, then we lost it. And I don't blame James Gunn for not being able to release it right now with them trying to promote their new thing. It would kind of seem like a different kind of thing, but obviously Gunn has a lot of respect for the movie because he did make a sequel that didn't completely ignore that movie, right? And has continued some of those same characters and castings into his new DC universe. So in some ways, it is the most long-standing DCEU project there is because it's carried over the most. I mean, Creature Commandos almost completely calls back to it, right? It feels like a third Suicide Squad movie.
That's actually a really good point. It's kind of funny to think about how Suicide Squad is potentially the most impactful DC movie that we have actually gotten over the last 10 years, because that is very true of how much it has impacted the DCU, with James Gunn. because there's even some rumors and word that Margot Robbie might be showing up as Harley Quinn in Superman Man of Tomorrow. So it's like, it is interesting that world has kind of continued over with James Gunn, and that he seems to have really liked some of those characters and all that. So that is fascinating. And kind of to go back to your previous statement too, I do agree with you that I think they kind of missed the boat on releasing, the Ayer Cut, right after Zack Snyder's Justice League, would have been a really good moment, I think, to do it. Obviously, Zack Snyder's Justice League was really popular on streaming. With COVID, everybody was looking for new stuff to watch. Like, getting that out there would have been great. I would also argue another time that would have been interesting to release it would have been actually after Aquaman and the Aquaman 2, kind of once the DCEU was over. Like, it could have been a really interesting palate cleanser, like in that 1.5 to 2 year period where there really wasn't anything coming out that was DCU related, that I think James Gunn could have almost maybe positioned it as a kind of farewell to the DCEU, that he could have said like, hey, the new universe is starting, but as the final finale event of this universe, we're releasing Suicide Squad, the Ayer Cut, onto HBO Max, or whatever. Maybe it wouldn't have been a good idea at that time. I don't know. But, I definitely agree that I don't know why they never released it, especially after what happened with Zack Snyder's Justice League. But, it probably had to do with the studio wars, like you mentioned, that there was so much going on. And we're going to talk way more about that when we get to Black Adam and some of the other movies. But yeah, there was so much politics going on.
So I'm hoping that we see the Ayer Cut within the next year. I think that is extreme hopium and copium on my part, because it'll be the 10th anniversary. But I think what's more realistic, that's the optimistic. What's more realistic is that maybe we could get an announcement for the 10-year anniversary and get it in 2027 or 2028. I think we need to see what happens with the sale of Warner Brothers. If that happens, we need to see what happens with Supergirl. We need to see what happens with the Superman sequel. And once there are a couple movies in, maybe a 2027, 2028 release. I'd be happy with it on streaming. I'd love to own a Blu-ray of it, though, like they did with the Snyder Cut. I don't know if I see it happening. And that's the pessimistic take. It's like, it's been so long now. Do people still want it? Besides the diehards, is there an audience for it? Can it be released? Can it be done? How much would it cost? Is it as expensive? Will Ayer want reshoots? I think he said he hasn't. He's obviously been championing for it, but even he said he gave up. Stranger things have happened. We've had cuts for other movies come out way, way, way later. Look at Superman 2, right? And the Richard Donner cut. But for Ayer and for the fans, for the DCU, and for my own headcanon, I hope it happens, because it'd be nice to be able to have like Man of Steel, BVS Ultimate Cut, and Suicide Squad Ayer Cut, and Snyder Cut as like one big thing. And you can probably lump in, and you can obviously lump in Wonder Woman. You can also lump in Aquaman, because Snyder still had a lot of influence on that. Probably Wonder Woman 84 as well. And you have two like diverging like timelines, you could say. And you can thank the Flash for that. The Flash actually justifies Zack Snyder's Justice League as being the canon one for the Flash and for the main DCU, but it allows the existence of other timelines due to how they explain time travel in that movie. So I would have liked to see what the original score was. I didn't mind the Pop and Fuse radio play you mentioned, because it had that Guardians of the Galaxy feel, and it did add to the strength of that first act. There's just so much missing. It's hard not to talk about this movie and not think about what could have been. And the world building is still decent. It still furthers the DCU. It does its job. But it's at best a 6 out of 10 movie. Like 3 stars is what I would give it. I used to have it at 3.5, but that's when I was a little bit more optimistic when I was younger. But being honest, like, it's super flawed, right? It starts out really promising and then goes downhill pretty quickly. And I just want the Ayer Cut, man. Like, Suicide Squad is not a bad movie, but it's dangerously close to being one.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Like, I think, the three stars out of 5 is very accurate for me as well. The first act, like you said, is so strong. When I was rewatching it for this podcast, and I was thinking like, man, this movie is so much better than I remember it being, and then of course, it kind of goes downhill in that second and third act. But it's like, yeah, it's I enjoy the world building very much. I like how it feels like it exists within the world of BBS, and I like how it follows up after, Superman's death. Like, that was something I really liked. I thought it was really interesting of like, hey, Superman exists. Why do we need other heroes? And it was kind of interesting of like, hey, his death provided this opening for like, hey, this is why the world of heroes needs to expand. And that was just fascinating. I really liked that, but completely agree that it's a decent movie that's in danger of being a bad movie. That was a perfect way to say it.
It is the probably definition of a studio meddling nest. In some ways, even more so than Justice League. With the exception of like Superman's Lip, Justice League, I think, is a more coherent movie than Suicide Squad is. Yeah, I enjoy it, and I will likely defend it. But now that we've had the Snyder Cut, the Ayer Cut needs to have its day.
Completely agree. I remember when I saw, this movie in theaters, I overall enjoyed it. Like, I didn't have I didn't have a lot of the issues that a lot of people had. I was just like, oh, fun popcorn movie, whatever, but like you said, flawed. But yeah, it's like the Zack Snyder's Justice League and that cut just really showed us how much a film can change. And it's just made me very unhappy with what we have with Suicide Squad, even with the extended cut, that I want to see what is coming next. And I want to see what Ayer's vision was. And even though, like I said, I do support sometimes, studios holding, the directors back a little bit. Even though I support that, I also do support directors being able to release their full vision. I have no problem whatsoever with studios wanting to release their studio theatrical cuts. But then, you know what? I believe every director should have the right to release, the film that they feel was their true vision. That's it from us for 2016's Suicide Squad. And we want to thank you for joining Curry and myself on this journey through the DCEU. We really, really appreciate your support of the DCEU and me. It means a lot. Our podcast release of Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice actually kicked this podcast into the top 3% of podcasts in the country. So we really appreciate all your support and sharing this. And definitely, if you enjoyed this episode, share it with your friends and like and subscribe, to the DCEU and Me, so you don't miss another episode, because we have a lot more episodes in this series coming, including a surprise at the end. So yeah, we hope that you'll join us next time as we continue our journey through the DCEU.